Hello, everyone. Welcome to our next Contribute and Connect campaign Google Hangout. I'm Megan. I email you all the time and also behind the desk at Transcribe SI. And I'd like to welcome you to your host today will be Christine Rosenfeld, who's a PhD student who's working with Smithsonian Institution Archives this summer and looking at sustainability, resiliency, and all sorts of things about making the Transcription Center a better experience for you. And I will now pass over to her. But first, actually, let me say that Christine herself has a long history in being a citizen scientist and interest in all things exploratory. And she told me a story about playing in her swing set and looking out across the yard and imagining that she was collecting data and observations, including throwing a little ring out so that she didn't get lost at sea.
And now I've ended up as an intern at the Smithsonian. So
that's right.
Happy to be here. Thank you, Megan.
You're welcome.
So thanks, everybody, for joining us. We are here to celebrate the fact that you have endured a long and challenging process of transcribing and reviewing the entire Baird Index of Correspondence. So thank you for doing that. And today we're here to celebrate by introducing you to Pam Henson, who's going to wave hello to you here.
There.
She is the historian for the history of the entire Smithsonian, and
Yes.
she's anchored here at the Smithsonian Institution Archives. How long have you been here, Pam?
I've been here 40 years.
40 years. Okay, so you beat my 2 months by years and several
Many.
months. So okay.
But it's not long in Smithsonian years. We've interviewed 3 people who worked here for 78 years.
Wow.
And 50 to 60 years is not unusual at the Smithsonian.
My goodness.
I'm not an old timer yet.
Well, you still impress me and probably all of our volunteers as well. So we're hoping to get a fraction of all of your institutional knowledge today.
Sure.
So we're going to get all the institutional family gossip, as you will. I'm sure you have many stories. The kind of game plan for today is to start by learning a bit more about Spencer Fullerton Baird himself. We have some pictures of him and some good stories from Pam. Then we're going to move into talking about the text, the index itself that you guys all know too well, perhaps. Learn a little bit about the content of that, what it is exactly, and why it's important. And then we're going to kind of end by positioning the index itself within the context of other texts on the Transcription Center and other important documents at the Smithsonian. The final part is going to be a Q&A where we're going to get questions from you guys, and please submit those via the Google Plus chat window, Twitter at TranscribeSI or at Smithsonian Arch, or Facebook, or email directly to Transcription Center email. Keep those coming throughout the whole presentation, and we'll collect them, and we'll get to as many as we can at the end. Also, please go ahead and comment if you experience any technical issues. We want to try to address those on the spot to keep things flowing. So let's get into it. Let's start by learning some stories about Spencer Fullerton Baird from Pam. So who was this guy that our transcribers and reviewers have been working for so long?
He's a towering figure in the history of the Smithsonian. He's the second secretary, and he's the person who we credit for really bringing the museum function to the Smithsonian. Spencer Baird was born in 1823 in Reading, Pennsylvania. His family was Quaker. He was related to the Biddles of Philadelphia, who were well-to-do bankers. His father was a lawyer, although he died when he was 10. But Baird and his older brother William would explore the countryside around Reading and were really interested in natural history from the time they were children. And by the time he's 15 years old, Spencer Baird is writing to Audubon to ask him to help him identify birds that he's collecting out there. And he's broadly interested in natural history, but he's very, very interested in birds. And he would go on, for example, a 400-mile hike out on foot collecting birds.
He has endurance too, then.
He has tremendous endurance. One day he did a 40-mile race with somebody that took 8 hours, and he won. So he's quite a bit of stamina in his youth. And he just loved natural history. He studied at a Quaker school and then went to school at and began to teach at Carlisle College in Pennsylvania. And he becomes known as a significant naturalist while he's there at Carlisle. And he begins to correspond with the Smithsonian. So in 1850, through the auspices of one of his mentors, Uh, Marsh, who is on our Board of Regents, he is named the first curator of the Smithsonian and the first assistant secretary of the Smithsonian for the National Museum. Now, the first secretary of the Smithsonian, Joseph Henry, set us on course, but he was a physicist and he had absolutely no interest in the museum function. He didn't want to keep collections. He wanted to have scientific research labs. He thought that collections were just really wasteful of money, time-consuming, not at all what he wanted. Baird wrote to George Perkins Marsh, his mentor, saying that he had but one dream in life, and that was to become the director of a great national museum. So he comes here with this dream that he is going to turn the Smithsonian into a great national museum. And some of the founders of the Smithsonian shared that point of view, so the museum function was in our enabling act. He arrives in 1850, and he brings 2 boxcars full of bird specimens with him, and they include specimens donated to him by Audubon. As Audubon got older, he donated his specimens to Baird, and they come down to Washington and form some of the earliest collections that we have here.
I've heard a little bit rumblings of that boxcar story, so I'm happy to know. So
Yes.
That was really the start of one of the main collections at the Smithsonian.
It is. The first item that we have in accession is actually a collection of natural history specimens from a Western explorer, and we also brought in things that were collected in the 1830s by the United States Exploring Expedition, which had transnavigated the globe and collected natural history specimens all throughout. So as soon as Baird arrives, he wants to build this museum. Joseph Henry, his boss, is not terribly interested at all, but he has already set up a citizen science network. Now, citizen science is essentially what you're doing, which is participating in helping us learn about the natural world by volunteers, people who are not paid PhD professionals, often have great background in the subject area. Henry established something called the Meteorological Network. And we didn't really know very much in the 1840s about weather on the continental United States. So he has volunteers across the nation compiling weather records and of storms, of temperature, humidity, and really begins what is now the National Weather Service, begins at the Smithsonian. He, for example, figures out that most storms travel from west to east along the jet stream, something that we know now, and he starts tracking things like tornadoes and aurora borealis.
So with the help of all the contributors, then he can get that knowledge.
Right, and so Henry has already begun, and Baird helps him maintain this network, but then he also starts to repurpose the network for his interest, which is natural history. So he gets all of these people. There were many trappers who were up in the Hudson Bay Territory in Canada, farmers, doctors, military people stationed out west. And many times these are people who were living in fairly isolated conditions and really craved connection to sort of the cultural and scientific center of the nation. And Baird provided that networking. He wrote, on average, 5,000 to 6,000 letters a year.
Wow.
Himself.
Not tweets, letters, right?
Letters, handwritten letters. And these went out to all of these people because he just encouraged and supported all these people in long responses, explaining to them what they'd sent in, what he wanted to know about it, and really made them feel like they were part of the Smithsonian, which was really, really important. And so very quickly, the specimens start flooding in the door. And Baird at one point describes himself that he felt like the sorcerer's apprentice who had cast the spell and set the mops and buckets in motion, and with all of these specimens flooding into the castle, and he had no way to slow down the flow that he couldn't keep up with. So he was immediately successful, and the collections are growing by leaps and bounds, much to the dismay of his boss, Joseph Henry. But the Board of Regents strongly supports the Natural History Museum, and so it is continued at the Smithsonian.
Wonderful. Great. So it sounds like you had a lot to do then, like you said, establishing the museum aspect of the Smithsonian, and then making kind of expanding the network of knowledge, not just coming out of the institution, but also accepting knowledge, bringing in. And why don't do you have a picture of him you can show us before we move on to the actual
Absolutely.
text?
So this is from the archives, a picture of Spencer Baird, and he is in his younger years here. So if we can see that.
Move that a little bit closer to the camera.
So people can see.
There he is there. You may have seen this picture already but here it is in real life, or at least another version of real life.
Of Spencer Baird. And he was a very warm and gentle man. He just didn't get into arguments with people, and he was a real mentor to a lot of young naturalists across the nation. And whether you were just a hardscrabble farmer in the Midwest or a professor in upstate New York, he would still respond to you and take you very seriously and really respond the way Audubon had responded to him when he was a young boy.
So very welcoming then.
Very welcoming, and this creates a sense of ownership in the Smithsonian, which was founded for the increase and diffusion of knowledge, and we viewed as having a very public function, at least Baird did, along with his assistant George Brown Goode. But go ahead.
My last question before we move from Baird to the text itself.
Yeah.
Why is he your favorite employee? Because I read somewhere that he is your #1 guy, and I just can't move on without knowing why.
Well, I'm a natural history person myself.
Okay.
I specialize in the history of natural history. And he is such a positive person. He's such a nice human being. He is so supportive of the people around him. And he grows the Smithsonian by being positive and supportive and mentoring all of these young people. There was one of his collectors, Fielding Meek, goes deaf, and he's very isolated, but he keeps him living in the castle. The Smithsonian Castle was a lot of fun back then. They had a group called the Megatherium Club, which is named after an extinct giant sloth they had just found in South America. And these young men had this sort of scientific club, and they would get together in the castle, and they would drink beer, and they would have races down the hallways. And to even further incur the disapproval of Secretary Henry, they would stand under his 3 daughters' windows and serenade them at night. Didn't get a lot of points. And they would be out in the fields in the summertime, and then in the wintertime they would live in the towers of the Smithsonian Castle, and they would do research and classify the collections that they had collected all summer. So he had a wide range of collectors, and he really was a great mentor. He was also great friends with someone named Solomon Brown, whose letters were transcribed in the Transcription Center. Solomon Brown was a self-educated free black who Baird viewed as an equal. Pre-Civil War, he was known as Professor Brown, and he and Baird worked very closely together on all of Baird's projects, and he really was Baird's right-hand man. So Baird was a person who really accepted everyone and encouraged everyone to advance their mind, to learn more about the natural world. So he's just an extremely warm and positive person.
Great. It's really about partnerships at the Smithsonian family, and then also gathering global partnerships with all of the collectors.
Right.
Great. Well, thanks for that overview. Now that we kind of have a handle on who this guy was, let's move to the text itself. And I'm just going to take a minute here to welcome anybody who's just joining us, reminding you to definitely send in your questions via the Google Plus chat, Twitter, Facebook, and let us know if you're having any technical difficulties as well. So moving on to the index that you all know so well, we really want to find out, when I first looked at it, I thought, oh, we have some pretty old maps, I'm into maps, and lists of names and places, which are fun to look at. But I want to talk about with Pam today, what actually is the index, what is its relationship to citizen science, and again, maybe just recapping a bit, what role did it play in early Smithsonian Institution history and in history of science in general. So maybe we'll take a brief look at the text itself. I'm going to try to move things around, and then Pam will kind of tell us the story of it as we go.
Right.
So
it was a number of years after I came here that we actually found this volume and brought it into the archives, and we were kind of mystified at first, but a comparison showed that this was in Baird's hand, and that he had developed this over a number of years. So he basically began with Joseph Henry's meteorological network of correspondence, and then he developed his own sense. So he took an atlas because he was very interested in having biogeographical coverage. Baird, in 1859, as soon as he heard about Darwinian theory, accepted the theory of evolution, and as his friend at Harvard, Asa Gray, who was also a Darwinian, they were interested in the geographic distribution of life as it evolved out, and what were the relationships from one area or one environment to another. So I find it very interesting that he organizes his list of collectors not by alphabetical names, not by the types of specimens they're sending in, not by date. He organizes it geographically. So if he doesn't have enough of one type of organism from an area, he knows who he can go to and ask if they can send in more, because he wants this geographical coverage so you can see the evolution of organisms and the diversity of organisms across North America and Central America. The page you showed was actually from Mexico and Central America. And on the second page here, we have, for example, from Cuba, a man at the very top named Felipe Poe. Let me just do this carefully so we don't damage the pages.
Bear with us as we experiment with
camera
angles.
If you can see this first name here, Dr. Felipe Poe, he's a very distinguished ichthyologist, or person who studied fishes from Cuba at the Cuban Academy of Sciences. And he and Baird corresponded regularly throughout their lives. So he's a very important figure in Caribbean natural history. And we would send him specimens and he would send us specimens. We would help each other with identifications. But throughout this volume, he's organizing his collectors by location so he can then motivate them to go out and collect what he needs from different areas. And that's, now, the reason why historians today are interested in this is because we're very interested in the whole concept of citizen science. So what role have volunteers played in the conduct of science? And what this shows is a tremendous role. They built the U.S. National Collections. From the outset, the Smithsonian did not have a budget for acquiring collections. So unlike some of these big private museums that went out and bought their collections, we were, as I always say, dependent on the kindness of strangers to actually donate things to us. So we needed this volunteer network. Plus, we couldn't travel to all these places. Many of these places were incredibly remote, where these trappers are up in Hudson's Bay, things like that. So we could get specimens from places we couldn't reach, and they volunteered to do this for us. And the other half is that historians of science today are very interested in scientific networks. What are the relationships, and how does this show how ideas traveled from one area to another or one group to another? So we're interested in seeing who these correspondents are from different areas and what the network was. And Baird would often introduce one individual to another individual, furthering that network. So by seeing these names, you start to see who is in Baird's network and who then has some contact with other people as well. And it makes sense how, let's say, Felipe Poe would know someone else in the United States through Baird.
So Baird was then integral in establishing networks between other people, not just for himself.
Yes.
So he was invested in the broad,
Absolutely.
networked diffusion of knowledge.
Yes, he's very interested in connecting people together at all times.
So of course, a lot of this reminds us of when Pam's talking about the early Smithsonian relied on the donation of volunteers. We obviously think of you guys, our volunteers. You are donating your time and knowledge to us, which has allowed us to get documents like this transcribed, which then can transcribed, reviewed, which we can then use for further use. So we kind of see a lot of connections between the people listed here. They could easily have been your names listed, and Pam could speak in a lot of the same way she is about this, which is over almost 150 years ago.
Right. And often we will get questions from individuals outside the Smithsonian saying, what do you have, or what can you tell me about early connections from my city or my state? Often if a Smithsonian administrator, for example, is going to Portland, Oregon, he might say, what connections do we have? And we can go to this, and we can go to the Meteorological Network and show how there were people out there connected to us in the 1850s, 1860s, 1870s, that those connections go way back in time. And it's another way for people to understand how there's been a continual connection outside of Washington, D.C. with the people across the nation.
Great. Well, thank you, Pam. Before we move from this text quickly, we want to, well, actually, you know what? Let's go ahead and talk a little bit about some of the conservation questions with this text. So take us through a little bit, take us behind the scenes. What is it like to be an archivist or conservator? What tools do we need? What knowledge do we need in terms of the paper, certain weights, page props, folded pages? Walk us through that a little bit, and I'm going to try to move the camera as Pam narrates.
Right. Now, a volume like this, before we do anything with it, our conservators, who are very carefully trained people, look at this and tell us whether or not we're even allowed to touch it. This paper and ink is not bad. Much of our Baird correspondence, sadly, is on very thin tissue paper with iron ball ink. And if you try and pick the page up, the letters fall off. They're so delicate. This is much better paper, and the ink is not as destructive. However, if you can see this binding down here, and I don't know if you can get that angle, clearly there's been binding to the damage to the binding, which is why it actually opens more flat than if the binding were still tight. It's in relatively good shape. It's good quality paper. You see some yellowing on the maps, and when you see yellowing on old paper, that means there's acid in there. The more yellowed it is, the more acidic it is. The blue paper over here has actually held up very well, as has this paper here. There's a little bit of yellowing from contact with this paper here, but he's used a decent ink, and he's used good quality paper, and the atlas itself was on this very nice heavy stock as well. And what he does is he actually tips in these extra pages, so they're not part of the original atlas. He's adding pages next to the map to show who's in that area. To actually digitize it, first of all, we took it to our conservators and we said, does this need to be fixed a bit? And they looked it over and they felt it was in pretty good condition. So we, one of our photographers who specializes in historic photography, photographed this using an overhead camera. So a digital camera set over the top, looking down and taking each page. And if we needed to, we would put a little weight on the page, like you see here, to hold it flat. This page didn't, but this page, it would be helpful if we wanted to flatten it out to put the weight on it over at the edge, very lightly. We have since gotten a very good book scanner that today we would probably do it on that as well. But we've just received that equipment. But it has to be done very carefully,
gently, and
very gently. Before you can do it, you do a complete assessment. And then once you've taken the picture, the work has only begun, because we capture what we call metadata, which is for every image, what is the, how does it a part of a whole, who scanned it, what format, what was the date of the format, what equipment did you use. All of these things are important for maintaining the digital image down the road. So we have to put all this metadata in, also what collection number it comes from in Smithsonian Archives, etc. So you have to fill out a lot of this metadata.
Right. And eventually it finds its way to the transcription center, where it lives for a bit, where volunteers work on it, and then you're actually able, as you all know, to download that document. And then it will go back into the main Smithsonian collection search. So.
And we want to make this available online now so that people, so researchers who are looking at networks, looking at citizen science, looking at if there's somebody from their area sending things to the Smithsonian, they can find it online.
Great. Okay, so let's move our next text. Part of this campaign was, of course, to get the Baird Index done, which would then unlock and reveal a surprise. And that has been opened last week. And we're going to move now to that. That is the doll notebook from 1865 to 1867.
Right.
Let's just tilt the camera down so we can have a opening of this present. This is how the this book, which is delicate, is packaged.
This is much more delicate than the Baird one. The binding has really begun to come apart. But this is a notebook that William Healy Dahl took with him when he went in 1865 on a trip to Alaska as part of the Western Union Telegraph Expedition. As you see, he leaves from San Francisco in January of 1865. This page has just completely come away from its binding, so you can see that. And it's just typical field notes of a young man out in the field. He's 21 years old when he heads out here.
Wow.
Not very experienced, and as we see, we can actually see August 4th here. He's talking about the weather conditions, the birds that he's seeing, the fish that they're collecting, because he's on a boat at this point, and they're going into the Bering Sea. So every single day, he'll record natural history observations, weather observations, and things of that sort. There are some lovely drawings in here that he did of Native Americans and different sites, but we also have down here where you kept track of all your accounts when you're on a field trip as well. So every cent that you spend along the way, you have to account for when you come back from your expedition, and so you see this here as well. And they're just wonderful notebooks because he really gives us wonderful descriptions of what he sees around him. You'll see just little drawings on some of the pages. He describes an aurora borealis in great detail. I've never seen anything like that before.
So it seems like this book is full of scientific facts, notes,
Yes.
but also a lot of cultural information about the people he was interacting with, the built environment, which that tells us information as well. So his mother actually is mentioned on one page. One of our volunteers found that out. I think one of the earlier pages. His mother was a women's rights activist, so keep your eyes out for her, because she probably maybe appears elsewhere in the book.
Now, and this is William Healy Dahl in his uniform for the Western Union Telegraph Expedition, if you can see that. And he's
how
just
old was he at this time?
21. So he's a young man. And his mother is very, very unhappy that he is up in Alaska because he was part of this group that I mentioned, the Megatherium Club. And we'll look at some images that we have here in our archival envelopes. And the group, the Megatherium group, Dahl is not in this picture, but as you can see, they're just a wonderful group of young men. This is Kennicott, Ulke, Stimson, and Herbert Bryant. And so you can see that here, if you can hold that up. They're just a fun group of young men, and they go up there together. And the most dashing of them all, the initial leader of the expedition, is Robert Kennicott, who you see in his dashing expedition outfit. Is he a romantic 19th century figure or what? No. Very handsome in his
Smithsonian
outfit.
calendar.
Absolutely. But the sad fact is that he became ill and disoriented while he was up there, and he died in the field.
Such a young age also.
At such a young age. There have been questions, and we actually recently did a study. We do believe he just died actually of heart failure up there.
Wow.
But it was very sad, and needless to say, Mrs. Dahl, who's kind of a protective mother to begin with, was now really, really worried about her son being up there by himself.
Yeah.
So Baird had to constantly correspond with her and serve as kind of an intermediary. Now, she's justified in worrying, but he actually did extremely well and went along on a lifetime of field work and became a curator at the Smithsonian for decades and decades. And he actually, after Baird died, wrote a biography of Baird. They were so close together. He just really worshipped Spencer Baird. But this is his first big field expedition in which he makes his name for himself. And you're just going to see great descriptions in there of what it was like. At this point, it's called Russian America. It's before we purchase it. And there's back and forth how important it was, but certainly the descriptions of the natural resources over in Alaska, what's now Alaska, played into the role to purchase it from Russia. So at this point, they're trying to create a telegraph route across the Bering Sea to Europe. Once they go up there and they explore, the Atlantic cable is being laid at the same time, and they decide that's not really a good way to go. But we got this tremendous natural history collection, the specimens we still have over in the Natural History Museum, and learned a great deal more about this area. And he also did a great deal of observations of the Native Americans up there. So he had collected specimens, and we have descriptions and things like that. So his diaries are just wonderful accounts of that trip.
So full of knowledge, cultural, scientific, and again, to go back to where we opened, a great close connection between Baird and Dahl, so characteristic of the second secretary.
Yeah, he was a real mentor to these young men.
So I think we are running short on time, so we're going to move right into the Q&A to finish things up. And let me take a couple of these. So one of the questions we have is, will we get a chance from the transcribers? This is, will we get a chance to transcribe any of Baird's letters?
That will be difficult right now there are some letters that we do have, which we'd like to put online, but these letterpress volumes I mentioned, we're going to have to wait till we come up with a conservation solution, because we can't even digitize them right now. They're so fragile.
Oh, okay.
So there are some things that we can do, but we're still trying to solve the problem of how to work with these incredibly fragile pieces of paper.
And that's interesting. So the conservation aspect then is holding back the accessibility at this time based on the resources.
Yeah, and we have a microfilm of it done years ago, and researchers can't use that the original. They have to use the microfilm because it's so delicate. You can't even pick the pages up.
Right. So along those same lines, we have another question from a different volunteer about digitization. What kind of lighting is used in photographing or digitizing the index? Do you know about that?
That I know less about. Basically, that's a photographer's question where they have, the correct filters. We have to be very careful with these original materials about the light that we do. Also, heat. That's why we don't like to put archival documents on a copier, for example, because the light is too bright and it creates heat against the document, and it can actually age the document if you do that. So you have to have. Usually you have offset light where it's, if you think of how photographic studios do it, where they bounce the light off something onto the object rather than the light going right down on the item itself.
It's a whole set of rules for the conservators to learn. So we have a couple of questions here about the women that may or may not. Are there women in this index? Are we going to be able to follow up, learn more about them? And then also Dahl's mother, Caroline Healy Dahl. Do we have letters from her we can share with our volunteers, or where can we turn to more information?
There are women. There are not as many women as men, but there are women collectors. And Baird actually hired the first woman employee at the Smithsonian, Jane Turner, to be librarian. So he did bring our first professional woman onto the staff, and we can say that. And in an interesting coincidence, after Jane Turner and her brother William, another librarian, died, Carolyn Healy Dahl wrote biographies of them. Oh. And you can actually find that online in the Biodiversity Heritage Library.
Oh, excellent. Great resource.
It is. And actually, a descendant of the Dahl family wrote a biography of Carolyn Healy Dahl. She's a very interesting figure and very involved politically. So if you're really interested, it's a great biography to look up there.
Great.
But women are participating, and they're sending in, they're writing, and being interacted with in that time period.
Excellent. So we have another question. Were specimens preserved differently then, back in the 1800s, than techniques used now? And maybe you could give us a couple details on how.
Oh, yeah.
Just a couple, or we'll be here all day, right?
Number one is the use of arsenic.
Okay. That's an important one. Sounds important.
Baird starts doing this when he's a young man. When he and his brother William, they go out and they collect these specimens. They skin them, and they stuff it with, they line it with arsenic to keep bugs from eating the skins, and put cotton in there. And well into the 20th century, naturalists used arsenic, and they also used formaldehyde and paradichloride of benzene, which are all very toxic substances. And there is a long history of naturalists like that dying of various cancers such as liver, stomach, etc. cancer, which probably comes from handling those types of things. So not only do we not use things like that today, for example, when I did an exhibit on the history of the Smithsonian for 150th anniversary, we included some of Baird's specimens. But before we could put them on display, they had to be sent out to a special conservator to remove all of the arsenic before anyone can handle those. So it's a major problem in old natural history collections, how you carefully handle these things so these toxic substances don't harm people today. And we have much more less lethal substances to prevent pests. But pest control is always a crisis when you're in the field, because it's damp, it can be mold, all kinds of pests. So it's always a problem. How are you going to preserve these things out in the field?
Well, it can be dangerous, it turns out, for the collectors and the conservators. So better watch out. Museums we thought were safe, but so one last question I think we'll end with is, we see a lot of maps in this book, and maps are significant because borders have changed, place names change, language has changed. Do you see any potential use for, mapping, making a map visual for this data or other data to visualize the networks that you've talked about?
There are programs out there now where people are doing this, and we've done a bit of it with the network of James Smithson, our founding donor. And it is really interesting to see, and you can then start with a map like this, and then you look at the correspondence, and you start seeing letters going from here, and just all these cross lines and connections from here to there, and you start to see how this community interacts with each other over time. And the maps really allow you to see if there's just more of one direction or another. In the early years in the United States, most specimens were sent to Europe for identification.
Oh, okay.
So what you would see over time if you were mapping is, after a while, people in the United States or the colonial era, they stopped sending things to Europe because they want to have an American description and an American museum. And the network moves from London and Paris to Washington, D.C.
Fascinating, okay.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of knowledge then you can get from, kind of looking for patterns in different ways.
You would see changes in those relationships over time.
So we'll keep that in mind. We hope to do some type of mapping at some point in the Transcription Center. And I think that's going to round out all we can take from Pam in 30 minutes' time. Thank you so much. To end, I'm just going to thank Pam Henson for giving us the last bit of a Monday, and also to all of you volunteers for transcribing so diligently and reviewing so diligently, for all your work, not just on this index, the Transcription Center in general, and Megan, who are behind the scenes, are behind the scenes, are going to pop behind us to say hello and goodbye. We have two representatives from SIA, Smithsonian Institution Archives, Rick and Courtney, and Megan just gave a wave there, so this is our true behind-the-scenes look. We thank you guys for your enthusiastic support of all things Transcription Center and all things volunteer. Don't forget to follow us on @TranscribeSI and @SmithsonianArch. And also, if you're interested in subscribing to the Smithsonian Institution Archives newsletter, we put the website in the Google Plus chat window, so just go ahead and go there and sign up to get all the details. And we have a couple upcoming events to keep your eyes out for. Another 7-day review challenge. It's that time again towards the middle to end of August. And we're also going to be hosting a Wikipedia edit-a-thon this fall. So keep a little private list or tweet out the names of people who need Wikipedia records so you'll be ready to go. And then I'm going to end by giving a quick shout out to our current secretary, Secretary Wayne Clough, who, much like Baird, was interested in establishing networks of volunteers and expanding the community of knowledge, Secretary Clough is really excited at the fact that we have a healthy community of volunteers like you, digital volunteers in this new age, and so are we. So we're happy that you guys are part of our family here, and we thank you for all that you do for us. So I think we're going to end today. Thanks again, Pam, and stay in touch, everybody, through any of our social media sites. Take care.
Thank you.